Now, I've just made up these questions out of random to try and sort of illustrate how the power of how you say the question creates then the ability to respond in a very positive, forward way. So why do students leave? Well, for a start, theory would say why is not a good starting point for any question, because why in our culture creates a defensive mechanism in us. It makes us automatically think something is wrong, we've done something wrong, we have to justify ourselves. So starting any question with a why is probably a no-no. What's making so many students late for study? Again, it's an inquiring question. It may bring up some information, but it doesn't engender forward movement. Whereas if you ask the question, if you could change one thing, already you're forward thinking, you're not necessarily making a judgment about the issue of the experience of students, you're just saying what would improve it? What would be one thing that would improve it? Now on your tables you have got, you probably haven't picked it up yet, this handout, and it's called The Art of Powerful Questions. And there should be enough copies for all of you. If there aren't enough copies on one table, then scour the other tables, because I'm sure there are definitely enough copies in the room. And what I would encourage you to do, if you particularly look at page 12, there is a whole page there of sample questions. I'm not suggesting any of these are necessarily totally appropriate to your situation, but asking powerful questions is a skill that you can acquire, and it's something you need to practice. We often ask a question in the heat of the moment or on the spur of the moment, and once that question's asked, you can't take it back, okay? You've set the discussion on a course. So asking a really powerful and appropriate question is really important to shift a conversation. And often you need to think about what that question is before you need to ask it. Now, you have the perfect opportunity to do that in your preparation for board meetings. When all the papers come, and for those of you who do have mentors or somebody to help go through the papers with you beforehand, thinking about your role as a student governor, what are the sort of strategic questions you should be asking or could be asking as a result of what's going to be discussed on the agenda, and thinking about actually crafting and writing some of those down before you get there. It will make a huge difference to how you feel, because you'll feel prepared, and it will also give you more confidence knowing that you have a question that you've already crafted that is appropriate. It was quite interesting on the table I was at earlier. It was Mike was saying how a lot of papers had come about the proposed new build, a new capital build. And what was the question you asked, Mike? You asked at the governing body?
Yeah, I just said to them, like, how much student research have they actually done towards
this new build? Brilliant question. How much student research had they done? It's not a threatening question, it's an inquiring question, but it's a question that actually opened up quite a major change and shift in the way they thought about this capital build. So thinking about what questions you might ask before you go into a governing body will help you have more of a sense of purpose as well as to why you're there in the room. So there are rules, and it's in here. You can have a read of this at your leisure, but there are very simple rules about how you construct questions. Questions are made up of three things. They're made up of how they start, the construction, so the who, what, when, where, which, why, how. What do you start with? Yeah, you've only got that list. There aren't many other things you can use to start a question with. Remember the question mark over why, in terms of it not necessarily being the right thing to start with. Then the scope. You need to think about that the question is within the boundaries and the needs of the situation. So, for example, asking a question like, how are we going to save the planet? It's a hard question to answer. The scope is far too big, yeah? You end up going all over the place and random ideas coming out. You need to think about the scope of your question. What is it you're trying to achieve? And then assumptions. Most questions have assumptions within them. And trying to take out as many assumptions as possible makes the question more powerful. So going back to those questions I made up, why do students leave early, is full of assumptions that students do. Now, one assumes there is some evidence of that, but it's still full of assumptions. Trying to look at your question and say, are there any assumptions in this question that may lead people to respond in a certain way? And try to take those assumptions out. I highly recommend this document to you, not just for your role as a student governor, but in all aspects of life. Think about how you ask questions and what you want to achieve as a result of your questions. So a powerful question is one that does all these things. It generates curiosity, it gets out underlying assumptions so that if they're on the table, people talk about them and dispel any myths that people have around what's going on. It stimulates reflective discussion. People think about the question. The question makes them think and reflect and maybe question themselves about some of the things they've said. And most powerful questions lead to more questions. They are questions that generate more questions. Yeah? So your question, Mike, generated, well, actually, we haven't done that. Maybe we should. Maybe what should we be doing? Yeah? They generate more questions. And they create some forward movement. There's no point, and you know, in education we weigh and measure so much, which tells us what went on, great. But actually what we need to do is really get some forward movement about improvement and making things different. So when you're preparing for meetings, think about what role you're playing in relation to the sorts of questions you're asking. So is it about the strategic development of the organisation? Is it a monitoring question? Is it a scrutiny question? Is it around innovation and creativity? Which might be the last question I put up about what one thing could we do that would improve the student experience. So think about crafting your questions. And practice. Practice, practice, practice. So you could today, without it stifling conversation because you're afraid to say a question, start thinking about the quality of the questions you ask, how you ask them, whether they did generate forward movement, whether they enabled people to move on, to think more broadly, think outside the box, challenge assumptions. But this is your homework. Thank you.